Welcome back to Face the Nation and our panel of election law and security experts. David Becker is the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Chris Krebs is the former head of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the Trump administration. And Samantha Vinograd was most recently a counterterrorism official at the Department of Homeland Security under the Biden administration. Good morning to you all. Setting the table for a consequential week. Chris, I want to start with you. We're in that 48-hour window that Microsoft warned was going to be rife with attempts to hack people's minds. We've seen at least 4 fake videos the FBI and U.S. intelligence have warned are meant to manipulate. Yesterday, the FBI said there were 2 out there that are fake. Before that, we had disclosures that Russia was behind a Bucks County, Pennsylvania fake video and one targeting voters in Georgia, falsely claiming that Haitian migrants were voting. How do these tactics that Russia is using now compare to what you saw in 2020 and back in 2016?
Well, they've evolved their techniques from generating and launching content from, for instance, St. Petersburg. That's what we saw in 2016. You had the Internet Research Agency operating out of an office building, almost like, a normal business. Over time, though, given the improvements in the intelligence community, Cyber Command, and our own awareness of the activities and what they're doing, they've started to push the boundaries out. And so they're actually generating content and then they're laundering it effectively through other platforms like Telegram. And even now what we're seeing is a significant amount of laundering through X. And then U.S. citizens pick up this information and pick up these videos, and then they promote it on their own accounts and on their own social media platforms like Facebook. So they're moving it out. They're avoiding the techniques that U.S. law enforcement intelligence has deployed and developed. And so they're not as good, though. So a lot of these videos that we're seeing, they're actually quite amateurish. That's not to say they can't have better content coming forward, but really they're just kind of flooding the zone and trying to distract.
And confuse and so distrust of our institutions. Sam, U.S. intelligence has been briefing and disclosing. That's part of what they're doing to try to counteract this. We also saw early on warnings about Iran and what they are doing. The assessment, Iran favors Harris, Russia favors Trump. What form of influence are we seeing?
Well, Iran has 2 main goals in this election cycle. First, to denigrate President Trump. They have expressed a preference for Vice President Harris based upon Trump's record in office and their perception of what Mr. Trump would do if elected. That's objective 1. Objective 2 is to sow discord, and they view undermining perceptions about the integrity of our elections as an effective tool. So they are using influence operations to denigrate Mr. Trump and to sow discord using AI-generated content, really focused in particular on, for example, allegations of voter fraud. We should expect Iran to continue increasingly sophisticated influence operations related to perceptions of a lack of election integrity. That will last well after polls close, Margaret. This is the most attenuated election security-related threat environment we have likely seen in history.
It's not about just changing votes. It's about not trusting our democracy. Right. David, 76 million Americans already voted. So can we say those numbers show the adversaries are failing? Or are the election workers you're speaking with really concerned about what's to come?
Well, it has increased our ability to be resilient against the disinformation. The more people who vote early, they've effectively inoculated themselves against disinformation that might be inclined to be intended to help them self-suppress their vote or confuse them about how to vote. So the fact that we've had over 76 million vote already, and that's going to increase by several million more once all the mail ballots are in, once there's even early voting going on today still in about 27 states in D.C. So that's very good. That means the number of people that still need to vote on Election Day when disinformation might be very focused on them, trying to get them confused with very little time for them to be resilient against that disinformation, that's going to affect fewer voters. That's a very good thing. And I think we're seeing, especially in states like Georgia and North Carolina, well over 4 million votes in each of those states has been cast, millions of votes in many of the other swing states. And so far, very few problems, despite efforts to create problems, perhaps from our adversaries overseas.
And you would point people to the secretaries of state themselves, their websites for
Yes.
reliable information.
Whenever you need information, go to your state election website. That's usually the Secretary of State's website. Sometimes in North Carolina, Wisconsin, there's an election commission or election board. Go to your local election website if you know your county or locality where elections are taking place. And if you need help, go to vote.gov. That'll navigate you there eventually. Just rely upon those sources solely for information.
Chris, when you were in government, we did see back in 2018 disclosure by the general at the head of then Cyber Command and the National Security Agency say that the government at that time set up a small group to basically knock Russia offline, to physically stop them from some of these influence operations. Can the U.S. undertake offensive operations like that now?
Absolutely. I do think, though, that the infrastructure that the adversaries, so the Russians and the Iranians, have put into place may not be where it once was. It has moved. Keep in mind that earlier this year, the Department of Justice took offline a disinformation group that we track as Doppelganger. They took their various websites offline. And they did it in a way that was timed so that they could not rebuild those websites and reestablish the engagement with those websites in time for the election. So there have been steps taken to ensure that the bad guys can't execute their strategies. And in the meantime, you have organizations like CISA that are doing more with more jurisdictions on election security than at any other point previously. So they have a lot of confidence around the resilience of the system.
But what you said about using Americans to spread disinformation, people are becoming unwitting agents of a foreign adversary, essentially by retweeting or reposting some of these fake videos.
We have seen that, right? So there was another Department of Justice announcement that a media outlet based out of Tennessee was receiving funding from the Russians, from RT, a cutout Tenet Group. Now, to David's earlier point, this is why it is so critically important that American voters, when they're looking for information about the election, they go to their relevant local or state official. They know what's going on. If you're in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger and Gabe Sterling are probably running the tightest ship when it comes to elections in the country right now. They're incredibly effective. They're out there. They're putting information in the hands of the American people so they understand what's happening. And so when Russian operations like the Haitian voters pops up, they were on it immediately and they knocked it down. That is hugely effective in maintaining trust in the process.
Sam, we have seen concerns about physical security, though, as well at voting locations. The Democratic governor of Washington state has activated the National Guard, put them on standby, citing general and specific information and concerns about violence and unrest. You did have that drop box in Vancouver that damaged hundreds of ballots. There's an incendiary device there. Are there specific plots the federal government knows of at this time?
Well, it is a generally heightened threat environment, both in terms of complexity and the length of time that terrorism-related threats, criminal threats, and influence operations by nation states will last related to the election. It is just prudent planning, Margaret, in this threat environment for officials at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, to engage in detailed operational planning. State and local officials are in the lead for the security in their jurisdictions. Now, in my experience, particularly post-January 6th, those operational plans must include a full sense of all available law enforcement resources. National Guard is the last resort. You have local resources, state resources, and then as necessary, National Guard, as well as a clear sense of who to call when so that there aren't communication failures. Federal officials have invested a lot of money and time in doing exercises, hundreds of them with state and local officials, sharing intelligence and information, and trying to share best practices. But at the end of the day, the state and local officials are in the lead and should have clear operational plans for a range of scenarios that may arise, in particular, large-scale security incidents that may arise with little or no warning. We learned lessons from January 6th, and from my conversations with former colleagues, that operational planning has been underway for years, Margaret.
David, I want to quickly get you to respond to what Senator Rubio was raising during our interview. He was talking about the charges brought by the Secretary, or I mentioned the charges brought by the Secretary of State against the individual he highlighted had cast a vote despite not being a citizen. How is it that someone who's not a citizen could register and cast a ballot? How did that even happen?
Well, we have several protections in place to make sure it's very, very unlikely this is going to happen. We've seen places like Ohio, which has documented only 6 cases of non-citizen voting over a decade, dating back to 2014. We have places like Georgia that has documented 9 cases of non-citizen voting since 2008. So it does happen, but it's extremely rare. And I'm sure Michigan is going to go through the process of evaluating exactly what went wrong in this one particular instance. But it's also important to note, this is one case. It was very swiftly dealt with. This individual is going to lose his admission at the University of Michigan. He's going to be prosecuted. He might go to jail, and he's almost certainly to be deported. This is a cautionary tale. It's one of the reasons we know that non-citizen voting is extremely rare. It's not zero, but it's very close to zero, because the potential benefit to the person who perpetrates that crime, 1 vote in an election with 160 million ballots, is far outweighed by the potential risk that they're facing of deportation and other jail time, et cetera.
Thank you for that. I wanted you to explain the process, because I think explaining how our courts work,
Right.
how the systems are set up to deal with these things is important. One of the things disclosed in the U.S. intelligence report put out by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was that Russia is amplifying these claims of non-citizen voting.
Right.
So that's what happens.
Right, that's what happens, and there are plenty of protections in place to make sure that this is extremely rare, as close to zero as it can be.
Thank you. Thanks for your perspective. I know we'll keep you on speed dial throughout the week. We'll be right back. To dissect some of the new economic indicators we've been seeing, we're joined by Mohammed El-Erian. He is the Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we saw on Friday this jobs report that indicated job creation stalled a bit in October. There were some complicating factors like hurricanes and a strike at Boeing. But what's your perspective on what this indicates for the next president of the United States?
So most of the report, as you pointed out, was distorted in a really important manner by the strikes, by the hurricanes. The bottom line, Margaret, is we have an economy that has been growing robustly. Inflation is coming down. And the main challenge for the next administration is not just to maintain what is called economic exceptionalism, because we're outperforming all other advanced economies, but also to continue to reposition it for the engines of tomorrow's prosperity. And that's absolutely critical.
Well, we know the Federal Reserve is meeting later this week, may move on interest rates again since inflation is around or getting close to that 2% target. But for average people, they see housing prices are high, they see grocery prices are still high. Where's the scenario where those prices actually come down?
Yeah, and that's what everybody's expecting, but it's not going to happen. Look, the good news is interest rates will continue to come down. The good news is inflation, which is the rate of increase of the cost of living, will come down. But it's very hard to bring down prices. And that's one political problem, is when you tell people inflation is coming down, in their head, they think prices are coming down, not the rate of increase of prices. So it's a misunderstanding, unfortunately, but you've got to be careful what you wish for, because if prices come down significantly, we are then in something much worse economically.
And that misunderstanding being used quite a lot on the campaign trail, Mohammed, as you know. I know the stock market is not an indicator of what's happening with the economy, but it is forward-looking. This week, what should we be expecting as a reaction to the outcome of this election?
So believe it or not, a lot of investors are just on the sideline. They see so many possibilities, be it for the presidential race, be it for Congress, or even the extent to which what is promised by presidential candidates will become policy. There tends to be a big gap between the two. So quite a few investors have said, you know what, there's way too much uncertainty. I'm just standing on the sideline and waiting to see what emerges.
A gap between what's promised and what's delivered is a very diplomatic way of putting campaigning there, Mohammed. But neither candidate is even making a gesture towards reducing the debt burden in this country. And in terms of what's being promised, the plan that the vice president has put forward is estimated by this Committee for a Responsible Budget to increase the federal debt by nearly $4 trillion through 2035. Donald Trump's plans would increase it by nearly $8 trillion. Congress, as you suggested there, they can put the brakes on anything here. But does this continued promise of spending and no promise of reducing it concern you?
It does. It does in a big way. Look, it was unthinkable that we would have almost 30 months of unemployment at 4% or below, and we'd run fiscal deficits of 6 to 8%. Remember, John Kennedy said, when the sun is shining, you fix the roof. Instead, the sun has been shining in our economy, and we created more roofs. Our debt to GDP is 120% of our debt is 120% of GDP. Look, both candidates, whether they like it or not, are going to have to find a way to moderate deficits and debt, and critically, Margaret, to create operational flexibility in the budget. The budget is becoming more and more rigid, which means that it's harder to respond to unanticipated shocks.
Unanticipated shocks. In terms of one of the things we have heard from the Trump campaign quite a lot is this pledge to use tariffs to create income for the government somehow. That's how Donald Trump suggests using them. Do you view tariffs as a regressive tax that will hurt poor people by raising prices for them? Or do you view them as somehow, a rising tide that floats all boats?
So tariffs are a dangerous tool. They have limited use, but if they are overused, they become counterproductive. It is not a good idea to promise the use of tariff to deliver all sorts of things, be it a lower deficit, be it protecting domestic producers, be it putting pressure, leveraging influence on other countries. Tariffs have a role to play, but not to the extent. And similar for the other side, industrial policy and regulation, they both have a role to play,
right?
But be careful of overreach.
Right, fair point. Mohamed El-Erian, thank you very much for your analysis. The economy consistently the #1 issue for American voters in this election. We'll be back in a moment. Joining us now for a preview of what we'll all be looking for on Tuesday is our Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, this is neck and neck. You've been telling us that for weeks now. What is it that the campaigns are focusing on and what we should be looking for?
Hey there, Margaret. So start with this. Here's the map. The states in white are all those razor-tight battleground states. But let's get beyond the margin of error for a second and look at some of the political possibilities, and we can show you that in our polling models. Start with this, what I think is one of the key dynamics in this race. There are voters who say they did not vote in 2020, and many of them, in fact, about 4 in 10, say that they definitely will this time. Among them, especially the men among them, are for Donald Trump, and the Trump campaign is trying to turn them out. So we wondered what happens if he does, and I'll show you. On this map, we're going to run that scenario through our CBS models, and if he does turn out a lot of those non-voters, those men, they boost him, he would do well across the Sun Belt, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and flip Pennsylvania, and that would be enough to put him over the top and give him the win. That's a hypothetical, but it shows you how one of those campaign dynamics could play out. Now, on the other side, there's another important dynamic, and that is the gender gap. We've talked about it a lot, and I'll show you a slide from one of our recent polls that illustrates that. So many more women voting for Kamala Harris. Well, you've seen the Harris campaign out there trying not only to get women turnout, but also some crossover from Republicans, and in particular, Republican women. So we said, what happens if she can get those Republican numbers to match closer to what Joe Biden got in 2020, driven in large part by women and Republican women? If I put that scenario into the map here our models show that she would hold the blue wall states across the upper Midwest, keep Georgia in her column, even flip North Carolina, and that would give her an electoral college victory. All of this, again, hypothetical, but it puts it in political terms, some of the dynamics that could play out, and we'll be watching on election night. Margaret.
And you'll be watching in real time as the data comes in to the desk. What is it that we should be tracking throughout the night? So
we're going to show you everything as it comes in. And the first thing I'm going to show you is where the votes are, because sometimes, and I'll pull up the 2020 map here in Georgia, just as an example, you're going to see red areas Republican, you're going to see blue areas Democratic, but I'm always going to show there are more people in some of these places than others. If I take this map and I rotate it, what you'll see in the example of Georgia is the higher bars reflect more votes, and there's more voters in Atlanta and Metro Atlanta. And Democrats need to do well in places like that, really get a lot of turnout there, whereas across rural areas, you see it's more flat on the map here, not as many votes, but Republicans very consistently kind of add to their margins there. That's one way we're going to show you the state in full. The other thing I'm going to watch is patterns, shifts from the last election to this one. Again, as an example, if I were to show you the shift that happened from 2016 to 2020 in Georgia, Democrats, Joe Biden at the time, got a lot of those counties around Metro Atlanta shifting blue. Those rural areas shifted red, Republican. We'll see if something like that happens again. So it's where the votes come from, how they shift. And the last thing, very quickly, Margaret, I'll remind everybody, is patience. If I were to take that same Georgia timeline and show you what it looked like at, say, 9 p.m., just after a poll closed, a couple hours, you see so much uncounted votes still in Georgia. Metro Atlanta hadn't counted yet, et cetera. If this pattern comes out again on election night, we'll want to say, hold on, let's wait for all the votes to get counted before we know the winner. Margaret?
Patience is a virtue. Anthony, thank you. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.